Today I am joined by Ahmad Abojaradeh, who is a friend of Be Strong Families and a fantastic, we're learning a lot from them and we are enjoying their assistance. And today we have a part of our Amplify webinar series on diversity, equity, and inclusion. Their topic is Beyond Inclusion, Working Towards Transformative Accessibility. So without that, welcome, Ahmad, and great to see you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Kathy. And thank you again for having me. I'm so excited to be here. I'm always really excited to do these webinars with Be Strong Families because I think we're really able to kind of go beyond some of the basics and really get into some of what I would call like the beyond conversation. So that's, for those of you joining us, that's kind of what I'm referring to with the beyond piece. It's not necessarily saying that we're all experts on inclusion, but it's really allowing us to kind of take the concept of inclusion and kind of place it within all of the other concepts that you're learning about with the various Be Strong Families webinars, right? And kind of going beyond any singular concept. So again, I'm really excited to be here. For those of you that have never kind of been on a webinar with me, my name is Ahmad Abojaradeh, they, them pronouns. I have a ton of various backgrounds. My educational background is actually in engineering, but have about close to a dozen years at this point of community organizing experience and a lot of various nonprofit leadership experience. And one of the things I kind of specialize in is kind of bringing various worlds together that normally you would be like, those don't fit. And so I'm also a certified peer support specialist. I also have a master's in conflict transformation and social justice and a graduate certificate in childhood traumatic stress, which all sound as if like they're all very, very different. But for me, everything is kind of connected, right? And so I utilize my own lived experience and all of those various educational elements. And so if you've been to some of our other webinars, you've probably seen some like manufacturing engineering tools being utilized for like accountability, right? Or or different like root cause analysis tools and systems and things like that you would normally be using within engineering spaces that I would actually be utilizing within like nonprofit spaces or peer support spaces and all of that. And so I share all of that really to center that as I'm talking about inclusion, right, and especially with this topic. And hello, Tammy from Pennsylvania, I remember you. So as I'm talking about inclusion, I'm really bringing all of those different experiences to the table, right? So my time as an engineer, right, and as a global quality manager and within various nonprofits and as a consultant and as a peer support specialist and kind of across the board, right? Inclusion is an area that that's kind of necessary everywhere. And I love that Be Strong Families is covering like diversity, equity, and inclusion throughout these weeks. To really, again, allow us to go beyond those various concepts, right? To really begin transforming our spaces.
Well, it sounds very appropriate to, if you're talking about inclusion, to be able to pull together those disparate strands, you know, because that's what inclusion is all about. And the other thing is, I think, I love it that you said what we're doing is the beyond conversation, because that's what we're trying to do at Be Strong Families. We're trying to like have the conversation that people aren't having yet, or have the conversation in a way that people aren't having it yet, so that it's not the same old, and it's not just reaffirming like our biases, but that we're learning and growing through conversation, because that's what our mission is. So before you get started with your, we'll just do the housekeeping. I'll do the housekeeping and then I'll back off. Okay. So ways to engage. For those of you who have been here, you know that the chat is the primary way to engage. Please direct your comments to everyone as opposed to just the host and panelists for obvious reasons. Then everyone can see what you said. I'll be probably reading what people are saying, but it's better if people can track what you're saying. So that's the primary way to engage. And also, if you have a question or comment and you want to be heard, you want your voice to be heard, you can use the raise hand function. And then Andrew, who's in the background, thank you, Andrew, doing our tech support, will unmute you. You'll need to unmute yourself and then you'll be able to talk. So those are the ways to engage. And then the agreements, in consideration that we create this safe space together for us to learn and grow and have the next conversation, we ask that everyone speak from their own experience using I statements, treat other people the way you want to be treated, be here now and pay attention. And if you need a minute, take a minute and come back. So if you agree to these agreements, type I agree. And Tammy's agreed multiple times. Right, Tammy? And Lucia agrees, and Renee agrees, Hilda agrees, Kim agrees. Awesome. But Kim, host and panelists, you want to put it to everyone. Adjust that so everyone can see you. Jesslyn agrees. Awesome. So without further ado, let's take it away.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that. All right, if we can go to the next slide, we can actually just jump right in. And I actually want us to kind of get started with a brief exercise. Those of you that have been in previous sessions with me know that I love talking about emotions and just how we're feeling about different things. And so just to start off, how do you feel when you're included in spaces, right? Or in whatever capacity? It could be work-related, it could be your family, it could be your friends. But how does that feel? Feel free to put that directly in the chat, or I guess raise your hand and someone will unmute you and you can share as well.
It's a deceptively hard question for me. I'm waiting for people. Love. People are saying they feel loved when they're included. Respected, appreciated. Feels good. Usually makes me more comfortable. It's a nice feeling, Kim says. Renee says, depends on the reason for the inclusion. Go, Renee. Stephanie says, valued. Andrew says, wanted.
Yeah, well, thank you all for all of those words. And yes, it's definitely one of those questions where it seems as if it would be really simple, but as you think about it, it gets more and more complex.
It has to do also with like what Renee says, depends on the reason for inclusion, but it also it depends on the extent to which you're included and how you're included, right? Like if you're just begrudgingly included versus like enthusiastically included, or.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's such a great point, because oftentimes, right, and we'll talk a little bit more about this as we move through the presentation. A lot of times the responsibility of inclusion falls on the groups that are not included, right? And so in those kinds of spaces, right, then you've already done so much work to be included in the first place, right, that you get there and you're just like, oh, all right, finally here. And so it does get a bit complex.
Renee says, are you the leader, the follower, the puppet, the center, the pitfall person?
That's all very fair, all very fair. So today we'll talk a little bit about the ideal version of inclusion, right, where we're kind of moving it towards that diversity, equity, and inclusion pieces, right, really making sure that our inclusion is transformative, right, and is kind of moving us in the right way. But you're absolutely right. There are different ways where inclusion could be used in really harmful ways as well. So if we go to the next slide. All right, so I wanted for this presentation to highlight just a few different types of inclusion, right? So if you're thinking, especially in the realm of diversity, equity, and inclusion, right, really thinking of inclusion, at times we view it as having a seat at the table. But to me, at least, that's only one specific type of inclusion. There's different types of power imbalances that could exist in various spaces. There's different types of being included within a space. Sometimes it doesn't have to be your physical presence, so you might not necessarily be there at the table itself. However, you could potentially have influence, right? Or you could have decision-making authority, right, and responsibilities. But again, not necessarily be at that table itself or at a specific table, right? So really kind of thinking of that, of as we're talking about inclusion, we're not just talking about the sense of physical inclusion in a specific space, right? So for example, let's say a group of individuals wanted to kind of come together, right? Let's say cis males wanted to kind of come together and have conversations around anti-patriarchy, right, and concepts of masculinity, and really kind of do the educational work to kind of move forward around a lot of that. For me, as a non-binary person, right, I don't necessarily need to be included in that, like that's perfectly fine. And also, it would be wonderful if that group of individuals were reaching out to non-cis males, right, to ask for feedback, right, to see, all right, like, hey, like, we know that this is something that also impacts all of you, right, like, what are certain things that we could be doing, right, within this space, and things like that. So in that case, we kind of have a little bit of influence, but we don't necessarily have to be around the same table for us to feel included, right, and to kind of participate in the various things. So if we go to the next slide. So one of the major things, and this is where we go into like the transformative accessibility piece, right, is that without access, inclusion cannot actually happen. And it's at all of those various levels, right? So the influence level, the decision-making level, the being present, right, having a seat around the table, all of the various types of inclusion are not really possible without access, right? So for example, if there's a space that is built somewhere, right, but I have zero access to it, right? Like, let's say it's a space that's built in Oklahoma, for example, and I am not in Oklahoma, right? I don't necessarily, let's say, have the means to get to Oklahoma for a specific thing. That's an access point, right? Or it could be different, like disability accommodation pieces, just various access needs. And we'll talk about some of those different needs in just a little bit as well. But really want to highlight here of that inclusion is about access. And by access, I'm not just talking about disabilities here, although that's usually where the conversation is kind of taken, and that's an enormous piece of inclusion. It's not the only thing, right? And so if we go to the next slide, before I really jump into the various types of access points, I really just want to highlight from the very beginning how we actually understand inclusion, right? In terms of what are the messages that we're receiving that are telling us we're either included or not included. And there's a ton of different things, right, that could send us those messages. Chances are the vast majority of us already know which spaces we're included in and which spaces we're not, right? Which spaces are safe, which spaces are not. It's usually pretty easy to tell. And usually we tell those things through things like symbols, right? And so symbols in this case could even be things like adding pronouns to names, right? It could be having specific specific order of things, right, that we go through. And so like Kathy starting with those different ground rules within the space, those could be considered symbols in that regard, right? And those give us a very specific message, right, of that this is a space where people are being honored, right, where we're each speaking from our own experiences, where we're going to be respectful of one another. And that kind of goes into language as well, right, of having access to language where specifically in like the program descriptions, right, in those ground rules, and also in the offering of the various languages, right? So Be Strong Families is doing both English and Spanish webinars, right? And so that's a big deal, right? That signals that for specifically like the Spanish webinars, right, that individuals who don't speak English and speak Spanish are valued, right, are loved within that space. And it's not saying that this space is not a space where people are valued and loved. It's just a very specific need, right? And so that sends a very specific message. Now, if Be Strong families wanted to include additional languages, so let's say they wanted to include Arabic in the future, right? That would send a very specific message as well, right, for various community members. And so let's say for me, for example, if like I see that there is webinars in Arabic, I speak Arabic fluently, I might not necessarily join the Arabic ones. It would be really lovely to go to them, but I don't necessarily even need to go to feel that I am included within that space, right? That space was built for someone like me, and there is value within that. Then we kind of have physical and virtual spaces. And this is really where we get into, we get into various types of needs, right? So there's the disability accessibility needs, but then you also have things like financial accessibility. You have things like especially if it's like, let's say, a physical space, right? Like maybe individuals are working at the time of an offering, right? Maybe individuals have children, right? And childcare is not provided. And for the virtual space, maybe individuals don't have access to technology, or maybe they do have access to technology, but not necessarily the know-how to, to step into a virtual space, right? And really be able to collaborate within it. And so all of those different things, right, make a difference. And so with like Be Strong Families, for example, right, the fact that that all these sessions are recorded, right, the fact that they are being live streamed on YouTube, right, all of those are additional access points. And it's not saying that this is like 100% perfect, right, but that's what you're kind of looking for, right, is those additional access points, and that sends messages. So again, even with like just having it live streamed on YouTube, right, or having the recording available, even if someone doesn't necessarily go and view it, but having that knowledge makes a difference, right? It tells everyone who couldn't be here that, hey, we still want you to benefit from this. We still want you to be a part of this conversation, and here's how you could be. And then lastly, different circumstances, right? And this could be a lot of different things, right? So I brought up things like childcare. It could be financial accessibility pieces of that individuals can't, and it's not necessarily just the fee of let's say different trainings and webinars and things like that, but it could also be travel. It could be the additional costs, right, of again, back to like children, because Be Strong Families works with a lot of like parents, right, and kids and stuff, and so a lot of those things do make a difference. Additional circumstances could also be just that.
So a common one, Ahmad, is like when programs that strengthen families want parents to be engaged and they want them to come to meetings. When do you have the meetings? Like, do you have them, if you have them during work hours, or and then what do you provide, in order, if you have them after work hours, do you provide dinner, so that those kinds of circumstances are ones that I think a lot of people in our universe are familiar with.
Yeah, absolutely. And Renee is definitely like saying meals as well. Right, those are big things. Now with COVID, right, that's also changing circumstances, right, of individuals having access to that, right, or we're still in a global pandemic, and so there could be various levels of anxiety and things like that, and even just like in the realm of mental health, right? Like for me, for example, right, I can't necessarily join sessions all the time, right? And so having access to recordings and things like that makes such a huge difference.
And then there's also what we found when you're scheduling cafes, for example, and picking a place that people feel comfortable as opposed to a place where people might feel uncomfortable. So for example, even if it's a child welfare related thing, people don't necessarily feel comfortable going to a child welfare office. Or a school. They might feel more comfortable going to a community organization. Or like when we had events across communities in Chicago, sometimes we would have them. It sounds counterintuitive, but sometimes we would have them at a police station. The police stations have community rooms. And for people coming from outside of the neighborhood to that neighborhood that was strange and that they didn't know, a lighted parking lot at a police station felt safer than other kinds of venues. So it's just those kinds of considerations,
Yeah, absolutely. And all those different considerations, again, even if we don't necessarily utilize them for ourselves, right? Maybe I'm perfectly comfortable going to a school, right? But knowing that Be Strong Families is mindful of that, that's what sends the message of inclusion. So if we go to the next slide.
Safety, that's what I was thinking of. That's a
Yeah,
basic need, right?
exactly. And so I always love talking about culture because I think there's so much within just culture as it relates to even just this space, right? Has its own culture, right? The different symbols and languages and the circumstances and everything that we just talked about, all of that builds specific culture, right? And culture, just evolutionary wise, right? It is specifically a combination of various safety markers, right, for different individuals to kind of come together, feeling that sense of safety, right, for our survival. If we're thinking of like thousands and thousands of years ago, right, we needed one another to survive. That sense of community was necessary, and we needed to understand safety within that space. And so culture kind of became almost like a byproduct of that. At the same time, as beautiful as that is, that's incredibly beautiful. At the same time, that also means that now we're negotiating what safety looks like with every specific culture. And culture is created almost instantaneously at times, right? So, like I said, this space has its own culture. Every webinar, right, might have its own unique culture. And then you have the broader culture of all the webinars. And then you have the broader culture of all of Be Strong Families, right? And it's all of these various interconnected cultures, but it's part of that culture that we're beginning to interrogate what safety looks like, right? So like I said, starting off right with those ground rules makes a difference, right? Usually when I start sessions, especially if it's like a longer training or something like that, I usually actually like to start with, can we all just acknowledge that none of us here are here to like harm others maliciously? And for me, that matters. And I do that whether I'm a participant, right, or I'm leading or facilitating like a longer training. But to me, that's important, of just to quiet that subconscious voice in my mind that's like, I don't know these people, right? I don't know if this is a safe space, right? I haven't seen the symbols yet, or the language, or any of those things. And for me, it's just a really easy thing of like, hey, can we just have this acknowledgement, and that's it, right? And then we move forward. I know in previous sessions we've talked about like the difference between trust and faith and things like that. And so I definitely always try to go into like that faith space. And also sometimes that is difficult, right? And so sometimes we want some of those markers, right, that tell us, okay, like this space is safe, right? I can be in this space.
Oh, can I give an example from Be Strong Families? Just for, when we do cafes, we have a specific way that we do these events, right? And it has a specific order. And partly that is us culture and a safety, right? Like that it's gonna progress through these stages. And if it's your first one of the first things we do is a one-on-one, where you're paired with a dyad exercise, where you're paired with another person, and everybody's sharing about the same question, right? And it's a one person talks and the other listens and the other talks and the other listens. And then we do a debrief. And it's very intentional, because the reason we do a debrief and we say, how did that go? How was it? Is because when people share, everyone has a positive experience. Everyone says, what did you learn about your partner? And people will say, beautiful things that they learned about their partner. What did you learn about yourself? And I felt like the reason we did it that way, we don't talk about it necessarily a lot in the training or in the cafe. We don't say, this is what we're doing now. But what happens is everybody gets the idea that this room is filled with great people, with safe people, with nice people, that everybody had a good conversation. Nobody says, oh, I learned my partner is a real jerk. It hasn't happened yet. Maybe it will, but we haven't, that's part of us establishing that this is a safe place with safe people, and more than just safe people, with beautiful people, and loving people. So I don't know. I just think it's like an intentional way of structuring the meeting so that happens.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. That's so beautiful. And I absolutely love that. And you're absolutely right of people don't even need to know why certain things are included, right? It still has the same outcome. It's still such a beautiful experience. And individuals feel included in various ways, right? And so everything that we're kind of talking about, every single space that we're a part of already has different pieces of inclusion involved within it, right? And we can probably all think of different spaces that are less inclusive than others, um, right? And that's something that we work towards, right? And things like that. But it's something that exists everywhere, right? It's just a part of human life, and I love that Be Strong Families is so mindful of those things, right? And is doing what you all can, right, to really make sure that that you're building spaces not because people are asking for that inclusion, right, but because that should be the default. And I
Right.
think
It's really important to us also that everybody's voice matters, and that everybody's voice matters equally, that's how we set up the table conversations too, that 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 there isn't, we trying to, it's not the expert and then the non-expert, it's everybody's voice is
yeah,
equally important.
yeah, absolutely, that's wonderful. All right, so if we can go to the next slide. So we've kind of talked a little bit about how individuals are receiving messages of inclusivity, right? We've talked about a little bit about various types of inclusion, right? Again, it doesn't necessarily have to be just access to a space, right? Sometimes having influence over a space or decision-making authority over a space or responsibilities around a space, all of that is inclusion. And we've kind of talked about some of the various things, right, that come forward in terms of that would kind of send messages around inclusivity. So those symbols, those languages, and so on and so forth. And so for me, I really kind of want to highlight and center a little bit of a conversation around transformative accessibility, right, or transformative access. And this isn't necessarily language that's utilized in a lot of spaces. It's language that's utilized within disability justice spaces and things like that. But it's really honoring that, and I want to utilize this in terms of like any kind of inclusion, so not just around disabilities, because it's really one and the same conversation, right? And it needs to go, it needs to be a part of our everyday conversations for everything that people can be. But it's really this model, right, of taking some of those things that we're already doing for inclusion, right? Those symbols, those languages, those different offerings, right? A lot of what Kathy you've just mentioned, right, in terms of what Be Strong Families is already doing, right, in terms of inclusion, and it's really making sure that those platforms, right, for access, that accessibility is transformative, right? And so it's not, and it feels like Be Strong Families kind of like utilizes that model, right? Of it's not just a one-off thing of, all right, well, we're going to be mindful of location this one time, right? We're always going to be mindful of these things, and we're always going to be making sure that we're trying to address the root causes that are leading to that inaccessibility along the way, right? And I know Be Strong Families kind of does this, right? Of as you're having those conversations, right? As you're building those relationships and having individuals like having that connectivity, there's also an element of how do we also address, right, why individuals were fearful from one another in the first place, right? And it's not necessarily being like, all right, let's sit down, like you were scared of you and this is this and all that kind of stuff, but it's through the programming itself, right? So I know I've done webinars around like decolonization and things like that, and like faith and a lot of those different things that kind of lead us to transformation. I know a lot of people in the space shared that inclusion feels like love for them, right? Like feeling valued and wanted, and a lot of that goes into some of the conversations that you all have been having within the webinars, right? Of having conversations around disposability, right? And how we value different people in different ways, and what does equity look like with that? all of that to me goes into that transformative accessibility piece, but it has to be, again, not just a singular response. It's also, as we're doing that, we're really addressing what led to these problems in the first place. So I want to kind of give an example of more in terms of disability in this regard, because I want to really make sure that even though the conversation is broader than that, that we're also kind of having conversation with that. And so when it comes to disability, for example, if we think of like colleges, right? So for years, colleges have been saying we can't do web-based programs or web-based education, right? We can't, unless you go to like a specific like online program, right? But most programs were in person only, right? And whenever that was requested by disabled community members for whatever reason, that was usually shot down, right? And we saw kind of what happened with the pandemic, right? Of things almost like switched over within college campuses almost like overnight. And it was like, okay, yes, we can actually do this. And now we're seeing that specifically like this past semester, that a lot of spaces have kind of gone back, right? Of that you have to be in person or you miss out on a lot of different things, right? If you're not in person. And so my younger sister, who is, she's a senior this year, she really did not want to go back. She did not feel safe to go back into her college space. And she didn't go back last semester, last spring, even though they had in-person classes, but the amount of instructors that never even set up the web spaces, right, where it took weeks, right, for them to even try to include her. And by then, she was like, I missed so much already, right, that like the semester is almost done. And so even though they were still kind of offering it a little bit, and you kind of had the option of like going in person or being online, that inclusivity wasn't really there. And if we think of that, right, is that was just a response. That was all right, we need an access point, but let's not actually address any of the other things, right, that are part of this. And so that's really why I bring up like transformative accessibility, because if those colleges were moving towards that transformation piece, right, then we're kind of looking at, all right, like, well, what are people's needs, right? Not just the pandemic, but historically, what do people actually need, right, to be successful in this space? Is it web-based spaces? Is it additional layers of support? And a part of that conversation would not only just be around disability and accessibility and all of those, it would also be around access to education in general, right? In terms of both like the financial means, right, and actual access to it, and also the reality that we all learn differently, right? And so, but like my engineering program, for example, right, it was one specific way, right? It was, all right, there's a few hundred of us in like the mechanical engineering department in that year. We all have to take basically the same classes. We had a few classes that we were able to pick otherwise, but it's all the exact same structure. It's the same testing, it's the same grading, it's the same everything. And so that's an equity thing, right? Where people don't have access to things in the way that they need them. However, it's also an inclusion thing, right? Because I didn't feel honored within those spaces. I didn't feel like that space was created for somebody like me, right? And even though I still went, right, and I graduated and I got my degree, but even to this day, right, I know that that space was not built for someone like me, even though I was a part of it. And that's kind of where, again, the problem with not having that transformation, and also like thinking of everything that we kind of talked about, right? And Kathy, to your point of that people don't even need to know that those inclusions things are there to feel that inclusion. And it's the same for the opposite, right? Of that we can feel unincluded even if we do share that space, even if we are there, and we are part of the conversations, but that inclusion might still not be felt.
So there's a lot of things that were occurring to me, and I don't know how I can say this, but so I think the intention, you've heard of experience design, like where the idea is that you're designing whatever you're designing thinking about the experience that people will have of it. I think Steve Jobs was like probably the first innovator of that, where he was more concerned. He was not just concerned with the functionality of the iPhone, he was concerned by how it felt to you to look, to interact with the thing, right? And when you think about when you're experiencing your engineering school, it's not designed to be comfortable for you or for a lot of people. I mean, I never really even thought of, when I was at schools, I never really, there was so much friction and so much discomfort with the way things happened. But I always just thought it was on me to, it was like a hazing experience, you know, like more or less. Like it was just about, you're supposed to run this gauntlet and get done, and then you get the degree. You know, it wasn't about, you know, having a good time or feeling welcomed or feeling included on that level. And I was thinking about one other thing I was thinking about while you were saying that is just an example of accessibility and inaccessibility is that I've been to very elite schools. And I chose to get my graduate degree at not elite schools, you know, elite schools meaning Ivy League, lots of money. And the difference, my aha moment was, oh my God, like when I went to my undergraduate school, the library was amazing and they had everything. And I literally had access to anything I wanted to have access to, any book, periodical, you know, whatever. And if they didn't have it, they would get it. Okay. And then when I went to graduate school, I thought like I lost the ability to do research. It wasn't that at all. It was that the channels to get access to the materials were like completely different, you know, and harder to navigate, you know, and sometimes impossible to navigate without money, you know. So I think that's an example of differential access, you know, even within a context, it's like, you know, you're learning, right? You're here to learn.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. No one cares if you feel included or not. That's fine. It's you're there for that degree.
You're here. I mean, and that's the other thing, we often make the mistake also. I think, you know, you're here, so you should feel included, right? I mean, you are part of the community, but there's no attention paid to how you feel as part of the community, you know?
Yeah.
You just should accept that you're part of the community.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's where like we go into that transformation pieces, right? When we go into like the beyond inclusion, because you're absolutely right. A lot of times the common discourse, right, is inclusion is just being there, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And so what would it be like if, like my example of accessibility of materials, books and periodicals and whatever, if every student at any school had access to the same materials easily, you know,
Yeah.
that would be a totally, but the root cause is that it's intentionally set up that way, right? Yeah. With differential access.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And so with some of those examples, right, it's a much larger root cause analysis, right, and challenges that exist. And really we're looking at this for like all of you, right, for your workplaces, right, for your own family structures, for your friends, right, for the spaces that you occupy. And usually those root causes are, although the root causes could be one and the same, however, because it's a smaller space, you're able to address them much more easily, right? And so if, for example, there's an area within like Be Strong Families, right, that needs some attention, that's very different between like Be Strong Families versus like Harvard, right? Because Harvard has so many barriers that prevent that from ever happening, right? Or even for us to even have this conversation, right, with someone with authority in Harvard, that by itself has like zero access, right, and requires so much work prior. And I think that goes to your earlier point, right, of in terms of the amount of work that we've had to do, right, to even have access to a space, right? And so thinking of even like universities, like the university I went to, it was a tech school, so it was mostly math and sciences and engineering, and they didn't have any female students, right, until the 70s. right? And by female students, I don't mean like, all right, 1970 has happened and like, all right, it's like 30%, right, female now. No, they started with like one. Right? I think they technically started with two, but I think only one of them graduated. And it was the same for Black individuals, right? It was the same for various disabilities. It was the same for so many different things. And it was like, all right, well, women are now on campus. And so inclusivity, um, but that's not necessarily the case, right? Just because we have access to something does not necessarily even mean that we have that inclusivity as well. Um,
So I'll give you other examples in terms of like family support and parent engagement, and this was some number of years ago. We were having a conference at another organization I used to work for, and we had scholarships for parent leaders, right? And so we felt really great about ourselves because we paid for parent leaders to come, and we paid for them to take the airplane, and we paid for them their hotel rooms and comp their registration and all that stuff. And then there was a big issue which we learned from, but at the hotel, because people needed to have a credit card to be able to check in for incidentals. And we forgot about that. So the first parents that were checking in, didn't have a credit card, which was a source of embarrassment for them, right? And we fixed it. We got there and we put our credit card down so that wouldn't happen to other people. But it's just like thinking about that, like how included, and then how included do you feel if when you get there and you're in a discomfort, like you were saying, like you haven't been on a plane before, maybe you haven't been to this kind of thing before, and your first experience there is being told, you don't fit, so it's like that inclusion and access versus total inclusion, or the transformation piece. And I think, you can have good intentions, but you have to learn about what the needs are, in real time.
yeah,
Sometimes.
yeah, absolutely. So let's go to the next slide. I actually want us to do this exercise with everyone. And so we'll go through it. And then as I'm going through it, I want you to kind of think of a space that you're thinking of that you would like to make more inclusive. So it could be your workspace, it could be within family members, it could be even just within yourself, right? Within your own home. Because there can always be additional inclusivity. It could be with your friends, it could be with anything that you would like. But so kind of think of one. And as we go through this step by step, I want you to kind of walk through this with us. And then feel free to share things in the chat, or again, raise your hand and we can kind of unmute you. But so these are kind of like 6 steps, right? To really think through how to make how to make spaces more inclusive. We can add additional steps, right? We can break down some of these into additional steps. Some steps may take more time than others. Sometimes you might have to move things around. And that last step, right, is that you're repeating as needed, right? So it's, all right, we just uncovered this, we've learned this, we're figuring things out. And also, all right, tomorrow we've identified something else. Let's do this again and again and again, right? Until we build spaces that are fully inclusive. So the first step here is we're really just investigating who's excluded. Right. So if you think of a space like this, right, as inclusive as it is, there's still some elements of like exclusivity, right? So in terms of, for example, I'm speaking in English, right? So that means that individuals who don't speak English at all, right, might have challenges coming into the space. The space is entirely web-based, right? And so if an individual does not have access to technology or Wi-Fi, or is just not comfortable with web-based spaces, maybe the space maybe they would be excluded, right? If an individual is deaf or hard of hearing, right, and there's no closed captioning, those individuals might be excluded. And the list can go on and on, right? And some of those things, right, are things where you're like, all right, well, I want to kind of work on that. And then others, you're like, okay, like I see it, and then we'll work on it in a little bit, right? And so you basically want to select whichever groups, right? It could be, you could work on all the groups, you could start with one, right, and make your way to others. But really what you're going to do is you're going to identify why individuals are excluded. Right. And again, so sometimes that exclusion is okay, right? So for example, Be Strong Families caters to a specific audience, right? And so if, let's say, I feel like Be Strong Families is useful for everyone. And so I'm like, everyone can benefit from this, but like, let's say, astrophysicists, right? Let's say individuals at NASA who are, or let's not go with NASA, let's go with like, I don't know, the Russian Space Agency or something, right? And they don't speak English as much, but like they understand, let's say they speak enough English, but also just these topics are not catered specifically for them. And so maybe that's not a priority for Be Strong Families, right? Of reaching astrophysicists in Russia. And that's also okay. But you're basically figuring out, all right, which groups, right, are you going to do some work to be more inclusive, right? And so you're identifying why that is, right? So if we're thinking of individuals who are deaf or hard of hearing, right? You're thinking of like some of the reasons that individuals are excluded, right? Is that individuals need closed captioning, they might need ASL interpretation. And so let's say those are the two main reasons, right? And within that identifying of why individuals are excluded, you could do additional work in terms of really getting to those root causes, right? And it could be just that maybe nobody was aware, right? Maybe that's not something that that has been on the purview, right, of different organizers and things like that. And so you would want to address that as well, right? So that's where we get to like that number 3, where we're addressing the short-term needs, right? So short-term needs, maybe we're not necessarily addressing the absolute root cause, right? Going into ableism and things like that, because that might take a little bit longer. But maybe we begin offering closed captioning and ASL interpretation fairly quickly, right? And so then we're offering the service. Maybe it's as we're identifying reasons why individuals are excluded, maybe there is also like a financial component to it, right? Maybe it's ASL interpretation does cost a lot of money, right? We don't necessarily have that in our budget, but maybe it could be in the next few months, right? And so all of those could be part of those short-term needs. And as we plan things out longer term, right, then we're creating a longer term plan, right, to really address some of those needs. And that allows us to go into the more deeper root causes, right? So it's no longer just okay, let's create an access point. Let's actually address this. It's also, let's go beyond that, right? So maybe if, let's say, it's not part of the conversations that individuals are having, right? And it just hasn't necessarily been, part of the conversation, right? What does that need? What would we need to do, right? On a policy level within a space, on a education level within a space, on a support level within a space, right? And how do we make sure that we're actually addressing all of those reasons for that exclusion? And sometimes as we're doing those 2 different steps, we're uncovering additional things, right? And so we're able to modify that and make sure that we're addressing those things. Number 5, because I love celebrations, right? We want to celebrate the things that we're doing, right? Of any little tiny thing that we've done, we want to make sure that that's also being celebrated, because that is a lot of work. Like, I don't know if Be Strong Families, at one point had only English webinars and then had Spanish webinars, or if they all started at the same time, but that's huge, right? Like, let's celebrate that. Celebrating more inclusion. Maybe it's different types of speakers. Maybe it's different audience members, whatever it is, right? Like, let's celebrate those little things that we've done, those little and big things that we've done, and really make sure that we're honoring that. Because if we're waiting until every space is 100% fully inclusive for everybody, we're going to be waiting quite a while, right? And so we want to make sure to celebrate along the way. because celebrations are wonderful. And then lastly, repeating as needed, right? And so maybe we've worked with one specific group to begin with, right? And built additional access points for that group. Maybe now we have time and space to go to other groups, right? Other challenges. Maybe there are certain things that in those short-term and long-term plans, we didn't actually address yet, right? Maybe a new thing comes up that's completely different than everything that we've been talking about. And so, right, like let's do this again, right? If it's it as a priority, right? And going through them. And again, you could have more than those steps. We can definitely break them down a little bit more. And so whatever really works for you. But this is just to kind of give you an idea of just a potential pathway, right, to addressing that inclusivity. And again, if you're able to go into those root causes, that's when you're able to really get it to a transformative accessibility space versus just a response. And this isn't saying that in the immediate term that a response is horrible or something like that. We want to do what we can today, right, for that inclusivity. And we want to address the longer term pieces so that a year from now, we're not running into the same problems.
So Renee's saying like using accessible formats for documents, slideshows, etc., where individuals using assistive technology can highlight text and use their software. And when the company purchases WINN, Dragon, or utilize Dictate through Word, countless employees can have access to accommodations to make typing, reading, dictating, etc. possible for them like others.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's so much that we could do, right? It's so like, for example, within this slideshow, I'm utilizing the same picture, right, for all of them. And the picture has alternative text, right, for a photo description that would be accessible for individuals with any kind of visual impairments. Now, at the same time, right, like I could definitely have also been more inclusive, right, in terms of starting with that description, right, from the very beginning of even describing what I look like, right, and the background that I have, and things like that. That definitely also goes a long way and makes such a huge difference. And so it could be small things like that, but that make that difference, like we've been talking about, of it doesn't have to be enormous things. It just sends such a powerful message, both to the individuals who rely on that and to the individuals who don't.
Thank you.
There's any other thoughts from individuals? If you've done this before we end.
Renee says it's not possible to highlight your tests in the slides, though, unless there's another way to do it.
I can double check because it's usually just dependent on different formats. But I can double check that way as we post this online. And I don't know if the slides will also go online, but making sure that it is.
I think a lot of times, okay, so if you're investigating, yeah, we're working on that. If you're investigating who's excluded and identifying why individuals are excluded, I mean, that's the inclusion versus exclusion. But I think that the exciting part of one of the exciting pieces about what you're talking about, Ahmad, is the transformative accessibility, which seems to be also about like degrees of inclusion, like what we started with, and how people feel once they're included in the space, and how you can make the space maximally friendly, comfortable, welcoming, conducive for all the participants that you want,
Yeah.
and I think that's it's not like there's a perfect way to do it, or there's like, you can just learn these 6 things and then it'll be happening. It's an ongoing learning process that is a dialogue with the people who are there. How does this feel to you? And you have to be open to feedback. If you're as Renee was saying earlier on, if you're the leader or you have to be open to, okay, so what did this feel like to you? Do you feel like, I'm trying to create a space where everybody can be heard, but did everybody feel like they can they can be heard, you know, or I don't know, you have to create all kinds of ways for being able to have feedback
Yeah,
about the inclusion, right?
absolutely. Absolutely. Because you're right, it does go down to that feeling level. And it's not even like I've been a part of spaces that wouldn't necessarily be inclusive, right? But even just having that conversation, right? That check-in, even recognizing that, all right, like there are certain obstacles that maybe we can't transform a space today, but just knowing that somebody cares, right? That someone is taking it, right? And is going to do something about it, even if it takes a year, even if it takes 5 years, right? That's so powerful, right? And in those spaces, I was still more than happy to show up into those spaces, right? Until those things have happened. It's the spaces where it's the opposite, where you're like, hey, X is wrong. And everyone's like, no, thank you. Right? Like you're wrong about this. That's where that's also such a powerful message, right? Of that place is not inclusive for you, and it's really like moving beyond those feelings, right? And when we do make that decision of all right, like let's consider this, right? Let's try to build more inclusivity. um, Hopefully these steps just allow people to kind of just take that step back and really think of how do you do that as well, because um, I'd love to think that everyone here has incredibly inclusive spaces and has done the same work that like Be Strong Families has done. um, and also like uh, we know that there are still gaps, and but so we definitely want to still honor all of that inclusivity, all of those feelings, and um, yeah, and just work towards that transformation.
Yeah, and we've talked, I can't remember which conversation it was, but the whole thing about making a family inclusive
Yeah,
and and not having people be disposable, like having people feel like they belong, because that belonging is a, you know, a safety, security, Maslow's, you know, hierarchy. Belonging is so important, right? So
you,
so how do you feel like you belong? And how
yeah,
do you feel like your belonging is not in question, you know? Wow, thank you, Ahmad. It was a lot, and I appreciate it. Appreciate your being here, and this is Ahmad's contact information. Let's go. What do we want to amplify coming out of this? Transformative accessibility. Awesome. And then just going to let you know what's coming up with the next. We have a calendar that was co-created by all of you who've attended our webinars. And we put it together, and it's a perennial calendar. It'd be useful for everybody to be able to amplify your positive intentions. So there's the QR code. And then tomorrow is a Spanish webinar with Hector Salazar, diverse forms of expression, religious expression with different cultures of the world. And then a taste of a More Perfect Union Cafe on Friday. And then on next Monday, for the next 2 weeks, we're going to be thinking and speaking and discussing recovery, recovering together. So Robin will be hosting on Monday, Building and Rebuilding Belonging in Recovery. And then there's a cafe on for Sarah in Spanish on next day. And Andrew's moved me to my YouTube. Subscribe to us on YouTube. English and Spanish webinars are there. I think that that's it. Is that it for the day? Andrew, do you have another slide? Nope. Okay. Yes, the cafes are for anyone, for everyone. They're free. And anyone with a computer or a cell phone who can get access. But all are welcome, for sure. Thank you, Alma, and see you next time.
thank you so much for having me, and I'm excited for that calendar. I'm gonna have to order one. That sounds awesome.
That'd be fabulous. Thank you. Take care, everybody.